Tell me, panel, what is it like being a journalist of colour in Britain today, especially when the conversation keeps coming up about the fact that there isn't enough representation? Shall we start with you, Akil, because you seem to have the most experience from all of us in this group today?
I mean, I think everybody's interpretation will be unique to them. And if I'm really honest, when I first was working my way up the greasy pole, whatever, you were only as good as the ideas you came up with. And if you came up with really good ideas, then no one really cared in using current affairs when I was working what your colour of skin was, as long as you came up with the ideas. I've got to be honest with you, there'd be the odd individual that would be prejudiced in some form or another. But as I became a senior manager, then you kind of like notice at a lower level, in the sense that it's not overt racism that you might face in the streets, etc. But it was just that kind of, if you come from a different background to them, then it really kind of like becomes quite apparent, that difference. And you're not part of a certain kind of club. They all think in a similar kind of way, and you get a lot of people from a diverse background who get on who are very similar to them, and effectively being diverse is pretty much irrelevant because they think and behave exactly the same as the posh white person that they're interacting with. So my experiences have been, by and large, pretty good. And then I found, just with certain individuals, that I think they are a bit snowflake. It's in the last few years or so. I think they've got unconscious biases that they don't realize. So, there's a problem with, certain people have to be saved. So, Asian women have to be saved by some of them. And, an Asian man, African Caribbean men, whatever, they're misogynist or they're aggressive or they're all of these kind of things start coming in. And if you're a northerner, then even worse. And if you come from a working class kind of background, if you didn't go to the Oxbridge or, your type of university, the higher up the food chain you get, the more stark that difference becomes. So it's not prejudice and so much unconscious bias that I don't think any of them even realize that they're suffering from it.
Wow. What opportunities have ever stifled for you? Did you ever find that there was an opportunity for you, but it didn't come your way?
Oh, so many towards the end. So many in the last few years. I was at the bit, yeah. I mean, sometimes you're not the right person for the job anyway. You have to be honest about that. Sometimes somebody is just better than you. There's no getting around that. But there were so many opportunities that I either thought, I might be in the running for that, or I applied for. Circumstances can get in the way as well. But I definitely feel that if a management change can come in, and if they feel like you, there's nothing you can do. And there are a number of occasions where I was short in the last 2 or 3 for jobs and never got them. And I look at the people that have got them, and it doesn't matter if I know them and I get on really well with them. There's a bit of me which thinks, if people really wanted to make a difference, I could have done that job, because there's very little difference between me and that person. And actually, even worse, I'm way more experienced than that person. So, it happened, and it will always happen. But, sometimes you've also got to be kind of like sanguine about it and just say, maybe my face just doesn't fit. And sometimes your face might not fit for a number of other reasons as well.
Mm-hmm. I saw Aisha, giving a little face there. Tell us about your experiences, Aisha.
I was struck by what you said about unconscious bias, Akil, because that's something that the BBC is a little bit obsessed with, along with many other things, aren't they? But it's there, it is there. And I've got kind of 2 experiences of this, because I spent a lifetime in newspaper journalism, a seeming lifetime, and then suddenly switched to broadcast a couple of years ago. And so the BBC in itself is a whole different beast entirely from regional press. I wasn't really aware of being a person of colour in the early years of my career, and I don't know why that was. I was based down south. I was living in an ultra white area called Wokingham in Berkshire, growing up in the home counties. It was kind of, Yeah, I never really noticed it, wasn't really aware of it. The first time I actually did become aware of it, and that was seminal actually, was at 2001, 9/11. And I think, I don't know, a lot of people might share that experience, that awareness of my colour and my identity as a Muslim really hit hard at that point and really defined who I became as a journalist. I don't know if it was consciously me wanting to fit in. Was I deliberately trying to blend in and not be pigeonholed? I think there was an extent to which I was doing that, and therefore wasn't really going out after the kind of stories that stood out, really, in terms of stories about minorities, for example. But also it was because of geographically where I was living, that wasn't the kind of stories that were being told there. I've not really ever experienced any real racism in the course of the job. When I was doing my notes for this, I remembered the first ever assignment that I had when I was a trainee journalist at Trinity and All Saints College, and the first proper journalism assignment I went to was, and we're going back to the 20 years thing now, because it was the Manningham riots in Bradford. Yes. And so I think this moment kind of sticks out because it kind of defined for me what kind of journalist I ultimately was going to become, in that I decided that to find out how people were feeling, I would go to an ultra-white working class estate in Bradford, and just try and speak to some of the people there about how they were feeling about race relations in the city off the back of these riots. And I remember speaking to a white gentleman and just having a very candid conversation with him about, well, how do you feel about race relations? He completely segregated community. How would you feel about me moving next door to you and inviting me to a barbecue? And he was very open, and he said no, he'd feel really uncomfortable with that. And I'm thinking, in 20 years, have we come full circle?
It's interesting. I did that series for the BBC, riots. Yeah, the riots in the north of England. Yeah. I did it. It's 19 years ago now, isn't it? I believe it.
Yeah, so 20 years.
And then the following year, I did a follow-up based on the sentencing of the men in Oldham, Burnley, and Bradford. Yeah. And it's really interesting because I remember I pitched it before it happened, and the riots. Because I knew something
about the riots before they happened.
Yeah, because we knew I was caught up in a real disturbance in Bradford, and I pitched it, and actually the riots literally happened a month or so later, and I was just given carte blanche, which was just do what you want. And when I did it, I always remember the head of current affairs sent me a note afterwards saying, you know more about this stuff than we do. And actually those are the moments where you realize that it's not racism in many respects. It's just a misunderstanding that people often have, and biases and all that kind of stuff. Whereas they didn't understand the story. The story happened afterwards. Then they reacted quickly. And I always remember I could do what I wanted, because at that point they'd realized this guy knows more about these areas than we'll ever will. And actually having those people in positions of authority is the issue. I'm not sure that many broadcasters and newspapers now have enough of those people in positions of authority, and that's why it's probably gone a bit backwards.
Newspapers definitely don't. Broadcasters do. Well, my two immediate bosses are both of Asian background, so I can't really say that.
No, not so much of Asian background. I mean, I'm talking about people who. I remember when I did the follow-up, I slipped that. I gave that to the controller of BBC Two, just a page of A4, and told her what had gone on. And her immediate reaction to me was, are you going to present this? I said, no, I don't present TV. I just make it. And she said, well, it's very personal. Let's just do it. But my boss, one of my bosses, said to me, stop wasting your time with crap like this.
Wow.
Yeah. So because there was no money in it.
Amazing.
I bet that person went far.
Yeah.
Well, they did actually, funnily enough.
They probably did. Yeah.
I'm going to bring Iram and Nasser into the conversation now. I'll obviously ask them to share their experience. So, Iram, shall we start with you? Tell us about your experiences.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just in this conversation, I feel like you guys have so much more experience than me, because I'm fairly new to this. But my sort of start into journalism has come from I've always been on a diversity scheme coming in. So my first job in regional television came through a scheme called Creative Access. I don't know if you've heard of them. I
know them very well, yeah.
Yeah, so they're a charity that get people from ethnic minority backgrounds into these sort of jobs. And when I started first applying for jobs, I was straight out of uni. I went to quite a good uni. I went to King's in London. I was sort of probably quite naive about it, and sort of applying for jobs, being not getting anywhere. And the only jobs I'd ever get were through Creative Access or any interviews or anything. And then I got my first job, and it was in Newcastle. And I'm born and bred in London. Went to very diverse school, very diverse sort of sixth form. University was a bit more sort of upper middle class sort of English people. But then going to Newcastle, obviously, you immediately become the ethnic minority. And I think people's understanding of me starting in the office as well, I don't think there was proper communication. And, they just assume you're on a diversity scheme, therefore you're not as qualified in a sense. And like, nobody was sort of overtly really rude or anything like that, but it's kind of what you said earlier about sort of the unconscious bias. And I feel like I really had to prove myself until I sort of got the opportunities that other people did. And then once I had, it was all fine. But there was always the sort of like, you come in on a scheme rather than actually just off your own merit. And even when I sort of tell people now, there is a sort of edge to it. And like I know a few years ago, Career Backers had a huge backlash with Katie Hopkins writing something for the Mail, and it's sort of been taken out from like the right wing press. But also, you kind of been like, oh yeah, I came in on a kind of scheme, and then immediately you can tell people like, oh, but you're like, oh no, like actually, then you feel like you have to prove yourself a little bit more. So yeah, that was my experience. And I've been very lucky. I've not really experienced any sort of overt racism, but it's in terms of sort of the little things, sort of like the unconscious bias, like you'll get called the only other person in the room, like your names will always be mixed up and sort of things like that. And always when there's a story that might be sort of relevant to your background, I always do feel like I have to push a bit more and sort of, I remember like being really angry about, the Finsbury Park mosque attack. Nobody was calling it a terrorist attack, but sort of if it had happened on the other foot, I was very aware of that. And I remember having like multiple conversations with sort of like if I was managing the website that day, or if I was sort of writing like lead-ins that day, I would always refer to it as a terrorist attack, and no one questioned me. But I think it's just having someone there to be like, well, actually, this may be something we might need to change. So yeah, that's kind of my journey.
When I think about my experience, I mean, I grew up in Leeds, working class area of Leeds, and I think one of the things for me from sort of early on is this thing that's often talked about, but never really sort of has been resolved, is class. I think class for me, sometimes in my career, I've sort of felt very uncomfortable in certain areas, and it's more to do with class rather than race. I found that time and again. I remember going and working at Television Centre a few years ago, and then just coming in people, and then perhaps when you're sort of born and sort of brought up in a certain area, and you sort of have certain, I guess, perspectives, I just felt that I couldn't become a part of that club or part of that group, no matter what I tried. And I did try. And I think maybe there are certain areas that I found which were sort of inaccessible as well. And I think people who do sometimes succeed perhaps succeed because they sort of get themselves into those areas. And that's the one thing I've sort of, learned perhaps maybe too late in the game. And obviously things like confidence are important and all the rest of it. But I think the key for me, I think over the years, to succeed, you've got to have some sort of, I guess, champion or some sort of mentor or somebody backing your case. And I think early on, I had somebody like that, and that helped me. And my early part of my career was predominantly in the South. So it was a big culture shock for me because I went from Leeds to work in Southampton. I worked in Ludlow, which literally I was the only Asian in town. And I was working in radio, and I was doing things like farming prices and stuff like that. And it was literally, I think the only other Asian that lived in Ludlow was the Bangladeshi restaurant owner who was coming from Birmingham, opening up his restaurant and then going back to Birmingham after that. So it was a very bizarre sort of occurrence. But I'll be honest with you, at that point, despite, being the only, there was no incidents of racism or anything like that. I mean, that I certainly came across, and I pretty much got on with it.
Did you find that you fit fit in?
Yeah, I did, and I guess I attempted to fit in as well. I didn't rock the boat in any way, which is part of the core. You know, sometimes I guess if you do, then you know you and I suppose when you're in your early stages of your career, you want to sort of get onto that first couple of rungs, don't you? And I sort of just bided my time up until I got to joining the BBC, which in the mid-90s. But prior to that, I pretty much my experiences were sort of mainly in English stroke mainly white newsrooms. And then weirdly, I mean, where I've sort of encountered incidents have been it's been sort of challenging stories. So when we had the whole Tipton story happen in Birmingham, you guys will recall, I'm sure, I was sort of posted out to do some reporting there, and weirdly, I got the abuse from the local lads, sort of basically saying, what the hell are you doing here? I thought so I've had that sort of stuff, or as you're going into a mosque, why the hell are you here? Because I guess that whole narrative of the community and stuff, the perceptions, I guess, of the media, rightly, wrongly, over the years has been that way, and that's led to sort of issues, and you as the frontline face image of the BBC are there to be shot at in those cases, and that's what's happened to me on some occasions.
The whole world is now currently talking about racial injustice because of what's happened in America in the case of George Floyd. Do you, as journalists, feel that the voices that are speaking out about this issue in the British media at this moment in time are the right voices? And if they are, do they resonate with you? And if they're not, what kind of voices would you like for there to be out there? And this is open to anybody who wants to start it off.
I think there are some, but obviously in my experience of I work in TV news, I think in some ways there is a tendency to try and reflect both sides a bit too much. I think there's sort of, I remember a report we did a couple of weeks ago where a lot of it was just politicians sort of. It was after the protest and after the whole statue had happened, and there was a lot of weight given to actually this is bad, this is you shouldn't be tearing down the statues. I feel like not enough was given to the reason, and I feel like a lot of the time in the broadcast that I've seen, unless it's like a chat show kind of thing in a news report, I think a lot of weight is given to maybe the trying to reflect say like the majority of people who don't really understand, trying to reflect just the normal person who may not understand the views. But I don't think enough is being done to sort of make people understand if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I think maybe the debate has become quite polarized as well, because I think the time it's all come, off the back of what we've seen over the last, few years with Brexit and everything else, I think some of that has sort of seeped into what has gone on, and that whole discussion too. So I think sides have become quite polarized, and there are some voices out there, but I mean, sometimes they're not necessarily on mainstream media. They're on other channels and other platforms.
Doesn't help though, does it, that if you're seen to be only reflecting one side of the argument? I was having this discussion with a colleague of mine, but it's interesting that my white colleague and I probably disagree on this, that we were talking about, there aren't always two sides. It's that whole thing about Trump when he talked about the Charlottesville stuff, and he said there were good people on both sides. Well, that's clearly a ridiculous statement. However, when you unpick it, there's something in the fact that our public arena, where we have our discourse, has become very polarized. And social media has a big part to play in this. When you face accusations of shutting down debate, I think that there is a space there. There is a space to have these uncomfortable conversations. So it was weird when Charles said that he wouldn't want to reflect the other side, for example, cover an EDR rally, whereas I said I would actually like to cover it. And it goes back to what I was saying about going to that white estate 20 years ago, that unless you engage with these people who have these misconceptions, how are you ever going to resolve problems? And like NASA says, because of Brexit, we've become ever more polarized. There has to be a middle ground somewhere. So you know, we've got to start those conversations. How we go about that, I don't know. Certainly I know that my boss wouldn't sanction and commission me going to an EDL rally, but I'd love to hear people's thoughts about how do we try and reach that middle ground and try to understand why these people are feeling the way they're feeling, why there is this hate, why there is this misunderstanding, and why people just want to be in denial about their history, about how we need to acknowledge the truth of who we are. So yes, colonialism was a bad thing, but when we start talking about reparations and all these conversations that are going on at the moment, you know, apologizing, toppling statues, you know, how far do we then take this? Surely the healthiest way to deal with this is to actually start talking. There's honesty has to come into the debate. So Britain does need to acknowledge its past. To some extent, people are starting to do that. However, colonialism was never on the national curriculum. Maybe there's a real conversation starting about that now. But I think we can go even further. And I do feel that I would like to sit at some point in a room with an EDL protester and just ask them, what can I do to help you feel better and to understand me better, and vice versa, so we can reach some common ground. And I think as journalists, it's really important that we are brave
as well.
We are brave in our approach to this, and fearless to some extent, because otherwise, why are we here? Why are we here otherwise? And also, when it comes to trust, the public not having trust in the media, I think that's part of the problem. That we are seen to be only telling one side of the story. And I know there are not always two sides of the story, but at the same time, there is something to be said about trying to make the effort to try and understand the other person's point of view.
I wrote a chapter in a book about, I've got it somewhere here, about 13, 14 years ago, which is about public service broadcasting, about how we don't have true public service broadcasting, because actually we have this liberal kind of agenda. And in this liberal agenda, there's only a certain kind of way you can think. Certain things are given weight, nothing's got equal weighting. So if you are a racist in whether Wales, North England, whatever, if you're a white racist, then your views are not giving as much equal weight as somebody else's. Now, you can have a conversation about whether or not that's right or wrong, but if you're a public service broadcaster, which is different to a newspaper and different to what we have now in social media, which is the further siloization of kind of like opinions, which has always existed. People talk about social media like it's new. Well, newspapers are silos. You buy a newspaper in the old days and still dependent on what your political views were, quite frankly. You know, you don't buy the Daily Mail if you're a member of the Revolutionary Communist Party. You know, you buy a Daily Mail because you believe in its outlook. Whereas when it comes to television, because of the regulation, and particularly because of, when you think of the main terrestrial broadcasters are all public service broadcasters. Even if they're funded by advertising, they're still public service broadcasters because of their license. They have to have that kind of balance. And you have to find a way of doing that. And it is very difficult, because I've got to be honest with you, the amount of times that I've sat in newsrooms or sat doing reports or documentaries and thought to myself, I don't want to give the other side, because I don't think there is another side, because it's either right or wrong. But the fact of the matter is, you have to, and there should be. And when it comes to things like the EDL, or people who have a view that no one's listening to us, whether that be, you know, a disenfranchised young African Caribbean guy or Asian person, or whether it be a person from the far right, you know, you do have to, if we reflect their voices, then we know what they really mean. And you talk about the EDL and all the rest of it. So I made the program where Tommy Robinson left the EDL and joined up with, the Cullion guy. And that was all because, that was all my fault. We were actually making a program where Tommy was going to just go and meet Muslims for the first time. And we were taking him to meet Muslims, and he was taking a Muslim to meet his people. And I watched the first cut. It was a bit soft. And I said, he needs to meet Muslims who disagree with this guy. He needs to meet Muslims with a different opinion. And we took him to meet other people, including Majid Nawaz. And then a few days later, I get a phone call telling me Tommy's leaving the EDL. And I went, oh, bloody hell, not now. I'm about to go and sit down at Old Trafford to watch a rugby league final, you know. And but we had to deal with that. But the fact of the matter is, you know, there are lots of stories, there are lots of voices, there are lots of things that we need to tell. We do tell them. We don't always often see them or hear them or read them, but they do exist. And we need to do more of that. And I think we need to be more honest about what some people think, because I think the liberal bias that exists predominantly in public service television, in broadcasting, sometimes lets it down, because they either for many years have ignored voices, and now in this, as NASA has said as well earlier on, in this kind of like Brexit related kind of like trying to catch up with something that they thought they got wrong, and we didn't get the mood of the nation. They may have been giving, I think they give voices to people who don't have any kind of credibility, but at the same time, that subject territory has to be heard, and it's a delicate balance getting it right. And I think at times they get it wrong because it's an area that they're completely uncomfortable with.
And it's kind of what I just wanted to make a point of what Akil said earlier in terms of, like when I was saying about people not sort of giving equal weight, it's kind of what you said basically about giving people a voice who aren't as credible. And like what really springs to mind is that sort of that Lawrence Fox and like Question Time, sort of that kind of thing is, is maybe something we should be looking at more as broadcasters, really.
Yeah.
Isn't there some hypocrisy? Isn't there some hypocrisy among the broadcasters around this? We talk about credible voices, and yet we've been platforming people like Katie Hopkins, Nigel Farage, Tommy Robinson to some extent, all these voices, and it's all about clickbait. It's been about clickbait. I think we are very much part of the problem. We are part of the solution, but we are a huge part of the problem, and I think there needs to be some honesty around that across the media, really.
It's a bit, I think some of it is a bit like, you'll all sort of recall perhaps a time when everybody, when they wanted a Muslim voice, the only guy was the chap from Al Muhajirun, whose name is
Anjem
Chowdhury. So, and he was pretty much on 24/7, wasn't he? He's probably had his own chat show, because that's what editors and newsrooms. And I think part of it is down to, I go into BBC Yorkshire, go into BBC Midlands. When I go in there and I still look at the setup, and I can do this now obviously as a bit of an outsider in a way, and you look at the makeup of the newsroom, you look at the makeup of the morning meeting, and if there's one Asian guy in that morning meeting and there's 11 others who all share the same background, they love a bit of stereotyping here, but cycling, or whatever, I don't know, whatever it could be, but they're all from the same background, the same sort of schools, etc., etc. That one poor person, he's going to stand up and say, well, you know what, I think you should do a story about this and this. He ain't gonna get a say, because the others are going to be pretty much dominant. And I think that's part of the problem, in identifying the right voices for some of these stories that we're talking about.
Interesting.
Does laziness play a part as well, though, sometimes, because we're all on deadlines all the time, and there's it's like this hungry news beast, and there's always demand for content, that the quality of that content inevitably goes down. And so we're just in that age, aren't we, of fast news? So that's
this race constantly, aren't we? Yeah.
But you have to be brave. I can admit it now, but when I went back to the BBC, the Anjem Chowdhury and all those people, the programs that I was in charge of, I made it quite clear that we weren't booking those people. And they got angry, and in fact there was death threats as well to me, and I was called an enemy of Islam and all the rest of it. And you know how dangerous that can be, to be referred to as that in the eyes of some people. But I thought it was the right thing to do, not because I disliked their politics and therefore I was going to cut them out, but because they weren't representative. And it goes back to what everybody else has been saying. The level of output that they were on and the level of opportunities that they were being given was not, in my opinion, was not related to the impact within the Muslim community. And it's the same thing with, I've got no problem with Tommy Robinson, bizarrely, right? Got no problem with Tommy Robinson being on TV, because he's actually put his money where his mouth is and led political, if you want to call it that, organisations, and he's not paid for to say things. He does what he does because he, for whatever reason, might believe in it. But your Katie Hopkins and people like that of this world, they shouldn't be on as much as they are, because they're not a leader, or they're not a political activist, etc. They are a clickbait right-wing person who I've met her. I don't particularly think she believes everything she says. Yeah. I don't think she even believes everything she says, to tell you the truth, because I don't think she's too bright.
Yeah, the same with Piers Morgan, isn't it? Because sometimes he'll talk sense, but on the whole, he's paid to be a provocateur, to basically needle people, constantly poke people on Twitter and basically get that clickbait. So, there is deep hypocrisy and a real sense of responsibility lacking, I think, in a lot of the media. One point I wanted to make in the response to what we were just saying, about representation, I think there's in terms of the people that we stand up as our spokespeople and our representatives, it is down to us to actively go out and find that plurality of voices. And that also includes being comfortable with or finding acceptance that we all within our own communities have different levels of voices. We're not all one homogenous kind of bunch of people. And so as I would say that I'm at one end of the spectrum when it comes to my Muslimness, whereas other people might be at the other end. For example, as if I wore a hijab, I know that I would be seen very differently in the newsroom.
Really?
To how I am now. Yes, I do. I think
in what way,
there's something around that.
In what way differently?
I think it's the thing at the moment. I think if you're a hijab wearing Muslim woman,
yeah,
I think there's something, it's become symbolic of something. The media machine across the board, I think, is on the hunt all the time for poster girls.
So would you
poster girls about?
Are you saying you'd get more opportunities if you wore a hijab?
I think in this current world, yes.
To tick that box?
I would tick a box, and I think there is a big issue there. But sorry, I veered off my point. The main point was that we, as a Muslim community, specifically talking about Muslim community, we are not comfortable with a plurality of voices from within our community. That we always like to paint ourselves as, you know, Muslim means so many different things, and I would say that I am one
which brings me
on the spectrum to that.
Aisha talks about, you know, how we're perceived as a community, as a Muslim community, and the opportunities that she would have got if she wore a hijab. And I think since the BLM movement has started, lots and lots of things have come out of it. And one of the main things that's come out of it is the prejudices of the Asian community itself. A lot of people are saying that we ourselves have issues with Black people, and lots of you know, journalists, you know, personalities have gone on record to talk about it. And I was looking at a YouTube video which has gone viral. I don't know if you watch Hassan Minhaj, the comedian from America, and he was talking about how we've got to start looking at our own prejudices, and really it's a time for the Asian community to also step up and to speak out about what's happened in America. What are your thoughts on that?